Listen carefully. There are some stories that were never meant to leave the dirt they were buried in. Stories that claw at the edges of memory like bones rising from the soil. Tonight you're going to hear one of them, but once you hear it, you will never be the same again. This is not a ghost story. This is not a legend. This is a record of human blood turned against itself, of a family so twisted by their own choices, they became a living curse carved into the mountains of Alabama. And if you can stomach what I'm about to reveal, you'll see that the Blackwoods were not only a warning, but a mirror, reflecting something far older and darker than just one family. Deep in Winston County, Alabama, where the Appalachian ridges fold into valleys too narrow for roads and too wild for the civilized world, there stood a cluster of shacks. 3 homes, sagging under time, hidden among trees that never saw a lumberman's axe. Few dared approach. Locals spoke the family name in whispers, Blackwood. They weren't just recluses. They weren't just odd. They were a bloodline that had devoured itself. The story breaks open in the spring of 1957. A rural doctor named James Harrington was called up into the hills for what he thought was a simple medical emergency. A difficult birth, the sort of thing backwoods families couldn't manage on their own. He rode his truck along twisting dirt roads until the path gave way, and from there he went by foot. What he found at the end of that trail haunted him until his final days. The property stretched 40 acres of poor soil, rocks jutting up like broken teeth, and on it lived more than 30 souls, all tied by the same blood, all chained by the same name. The first thing Harrington saw were the children. Faces bent out of symmetry, limbs shriveled or doubled with extra digits, eyes staring too far apart, some clouded with blindness before they erred. Then reached adolescence, adults no better, short of stature, hunched with bone disease, jaws that never grew right, speech that collapsed into animal noises. They moved through the dust with a kind of dull acceptance, as if this deformity was not a tragedy, but simply life. He wrote later in his notes, "What I witnessed that day was the degradation of the human form itself, repeated generation after generation until it no longer resembled what nature intended." But it wasn't just nature that brought them here, it was choice. For 3 generations the Blackwoods had married their own, cousins with cousins, uncles with nieces, fathers making claims where no father ever should. They called it purity, they called it tradition. In truth, it was entrapment, a prison sealed with blood, and at the center of it all stood Elijah Blackwood, the patriarch. 67 years old, rigid as an iron fence post, hostile to anyone who dared step foot near his land. He ruled not by law, but by fear. The fear of outsiders, the fear of corruption, the fear of losing control of the land and the bloodline. That night, Dr. Harrington delivered a baby into the world, but the child was born broken, a body twisted with extra fingers, a skull too small, a heart too weak. Within 48 hours, the baby was dead. For the Blackwoods, this was no surprise. It was just the way of things. They buried the child in the rocky soil without ceremony. For Harrington, however, it was the beginning of a revelation, a discovery so severe that he would spend the rest of his life trying to process what he had seen. Now I need you to understand something. What happened on that farm wasn't an accident of geography or bad luck. It was the result of an idea whispered in every corner of history. The idea that purity must be guarded, that outsiders must be shut out, that blood must remain blood. The Blackwoods were simply an extreme form of what kingdoms and empires have done for centuries, turning inwards, breeding themselves into weakness, collapsing under the weight of their own walls. But here's the truth that no textbook will ever admit. What doomed the Blackwoods wasn't just genetics. It was control. It was obedience. It was the surrender of free will to a patriarch who told them that survival depended on submission. Elijah said the outside world would poison them. He said strangers would take their land, their lives, their souls. And so generation after generation chose the cage, mistaking slavery for safety, mistaking deformity for destiny. Do you see it yet? This isn't just their story. It's the story of every system that locks men into chains and tells them the chains are protection. The Blackwoods were simply the most grotesque form of it, so obvious, so undeniable, that even doctors couldn't look away. By the time the state caught wind of what was happening, it was almost too late. Entire generations had been consumed. Some couldn't read, couldn't speak, couldn't understand the simplest of ideas. Others lived in silence, blind or broken, wandering the property like ghosts that had never left the womb. This is why you've never heard of them. Not because they weren't real, but because they were too real. A reminder that beneath the mask of modern America, beneath the highways and cities and neon lights, there still existed families trapped in ancient systems of control, systems that reduced them to something less than human. And here's the part that should make your blood run cold. The Blackwoods are not unique. They are not an isolated case. Their story is a keyhole, and if you look through it long enough, you will see something staring back at you. A truth about corruption, about manipulation, about how easily men can be broken when their choices are stolen. Stay with me, because this descent is only beginning, and what lies deeper will show you that the Blackwoods are not just Alabama's darkest family. They are a reflection of every cage you've ever lived in. The roots of the Blackwood curse didn't begin in 1957, when Dr. Harrington stumbled onto that decaying farm. No, the rot had been festering for nearly 80 years before his arrival, seeded in secrecy, watered by fear, and protected by violence. To understand why the Blackwoods became what they did, you have to look at the man who started it all. His name was Isaiah Blackwood. He arrived in the hills of Winston County around 1880, carrying more than just a wife and children. He carried a shadow that followed him from Tennessee, accusations of crimes so severe that even in a time when records were scarce and justice loose, he fled. Some say it was murder. Others whispered it was something far worse. What's certain is this: Isaiah didn't come to Alabama to join a community. He came to disappear from one. He carved out his land in the mountains not for opportunity, but for escape, for isolation, for control. From the very beginning, his words were etched into the bloodline like commandments. We don't need anyone. The world outside will only corrupt us. Keep the blood pure. Keep the family together. Trust no one but your own. Do you see what he did? He replaced truth with fear, replaced freedom with doctrine. He gave his descendants a prison disguised as a kingdom, and it worked. His children married his cousins became his children's spouses, his sons became husbands to his daughters' daughters. The tree bent back on itself until its branches tangled like a noose. By the 1920s, the genetic cracks began to show. Babies born with twisted spines, children too weak to survive the first year. Some never learned to speak beyond grunts and broken syllables, but instead of questioning, the Blackwoods treated it as destiny, as a mark of identity. Elijah, Isaiah's grandson, would later boast that deformity was the family's seal. Imagine that. A man so deep in denial, he wore the wounds of his children like a badge of honor. But let me tell you why men like Elijah rise. Because in times of weakness, there is always one voice willing to turn weakness into ideology. Elijah wasn't just a farmer. He was a preacher of his own gospel, a gospel of fear. He taught that outsiders were demons in human skin, that books were poison, that medicine was a trick to weaken their blood. He told them the hills were holy and leaving them was betrayal. And if you think this is just the madness of one Alabama family, look closer. Every institution of power in history has done the same. They isolate you. They cut you off from other voices. They declare outsiders dangerous. They tell you to cling to tradition at all costs. The result? Control, compliance, a population too afraid to step beyond the lines drawn for them. Elijah ruled not just with words but with force. He carried his shotgun the way a king carries a crown. When school officials tried to enroll his children, he yanked them out and declared that learning makes slaves. When doctors offered help, he spat in their faces. And when members of his family whispered about leaving, he reminded them of Isaiah's law. We don't need the world needs us gone. But here's the question you must ask. Why did they obey? Why didn't someone run, even if it meant starving in the woods? The answer lies in something darker than genetics. It lies in psychology. Elijah didn't just control their land, he controlled their minds. He raised his family to believe deformity was sacred, ignorance was strength, and obedience was survival. To rebel wasn't just to betray Elijah, it was to betray God, blood, and destiny itself. This is how real power operates, not through chains you can see, but through beliefs that bind you tighter than iron. The Blackwoods didn't stay because they couldn't leave. They stayed because they thought leaving would kill them. And so generation after generation bowed to Elijah's rules. They planted their corn in rocky soil, raised their pigs and chickens, and kept their eyes down. When babies were born broken, they buried them in shallow graves and said, "It was God's will." When neighbors spread rumors of their deformities, they didn't fight. They withdrew further into the shadows. Every insult from the outside world only strengthened Elijah's grip. Every humiliation in town only proved him right, that the world hated them, that their only safety was inside the bloodline. This is the tragedy of isolation. It begins as protection. It ends as rot. The Blackwoods are a reminder that when a man closes himself off from challenge, from difference, from the unknown, he does not preserve strength. He breeds weakness. He multiplies disease. He hands his descendants a curse wrapped as tradition. By the 1940s, stories of the Blackwoods drifted into nearby towns like smoke. Children whispered of the cursed ones in the hills. Farmers warned travelers not to wander near their property. And when two young Blackwood men, cousins and half-brothers, stumbled into a grocery store one summer, their faces distorted, their speech incomprehensible, the townsfolk ran them out as if they were monsters. That day, Elijah vowed that no Blackwood would ever set foot in town again. From then on, he sent only himself and his eldest son, Robert, down for salt and ammunition, their heads bowed low, their silence unbroken. Every humiliation hardened his resolve. Every insult deepened his isolation. And so the Blackwoods became phantoms, a family hidden in plain sight, existing just miles from civilization, yet trapped in a world centuries behind. Births went unrecorded, deaths left no trace. They became a shadow population, erased from official records but alive in whispers, folklore and fear. Do you understand what I'm telling you? The Blackwoods weren't just an accident of bad breeding. They were an experiment in control, an example of what happens when you give one man absolute authority over generations of blood. The deformities, the blindness, the broken minds, these were not just medical conditions. They were symbols of captivity. They were living proof of what happens when obedience is inherited like disease. And this, my friend, is where the descent truly begins. Because once you see the Blackwoods clearly, you'll start to recognize the same patterns everywhere, in families, in churches, in governments. Isolation, fear, purity, obedience. It is the same formula, repeated across history, dressed in different clothes but always with the same result. A people too broken to rise. So let me ask you, how many cages have you mistaken for protection? How many laws, traditions and systems in your own life have been nothing more than Elijah's shotgun at the gate, telling you not to question, not to wander, not to dream beyond the valley? The Blackwoods were consumed by their blood. But we are consumed by our obedience. And the question is, will you be the one who escapes the hills, or will you die inside them? April 1957. The world was on the edge of modernity. Televisions flickered in living rooms, satellites were being dreamed of, and medicine was advancing faster than ever. But just 14 miles from a small Alabama town, a family lived in conditions more suited to the 17th century than the 20th. When Dr. James Harrington was called into those hills, he thought he was going to save a life. Instead, he stumbled into a living archive of human degeneration, a nightmare written in bone and flesh. The girl in labor was only 16. Her name was Martha Blackwood, granddaughter and niece to Elijah at the same time, born from a union that should never have existed. Her screams tore through the shack as Harrington worked, sweat beading on his forehead. When the child emerged, the room fell silent. The newborn's head was abnormally small, the fingers multiplied like claws, the chest weak with a failing heart. The infant survived just 2 days. Harrington wrote later in his private notes, "The child was not born into the world, it was born into its coffin." But Martha was just the beginning. Over the next weeks, Harrington witnessed more than most men could endure. 32 Blackwoods lived across 3 collapsing houses, and nearly all of them bore the marks of their bloodline. Children who could not walk, adults whose jaws never grew, forcing them to slurp food like infants, faces distorted beyond symmetry, eyes clouded or missing sight entirely. 27 out of 32 had some kind of severe anomaly. Extra fingers and toes, fused limbs, twisted spines, stunted growth. None of the men reached beyond 5 feet 3. Half were blind or partially blind. Nearly 70% lived with intellectual disability, ranging from slow speech to the inability to form a single coherent sentence. Harrington had seen poverty before. He had seen sickness before. But this was something darker. It was decay made flesh, a bloodline devouring itself from the inside. And yet what disturbed him most wasn't the deformities themselves. It was the acceptance. When Harrington asked the patriarch Elijah about the conditions, Elijah laughed, as though the doctor was the fool. "It has always been this way, and it always will be," he said. They didn't see the twisted limbs or broken minds as a curse. They saw them as a family trait, a mark of belonging. Imagine that. Imagine being born broken, only to be told it was normal, that to question it was betrayal. That was the Blackwood gospel. Their sickness wasn't just genetic, it was cultural. It was psychological. It was institutionalized obedience. Harrington knew he was facing something bigger than himself. He wrote to colleagues at the University of Alabama. Among them was Dr. Walter Thompson, a geneticist who had studied cases of inbreeding in remote European villages, but even he wasn't prepared for what lay in Winston County. Together, the two men returned to the Blackwood property under the guise of offering medical help. They came with notebooks, instruments, and cautious intentions. They examined as many as Elijah would allow. They took measurements, collected blood, captured reluctant photographs. What they documented would later be called one of the most extreme cases of consanguinity in American history. The blood work revealed high homozygosity, genes doubled, recessive traits amplified. In scientific terms, the Blackwoods were a demonstration of what happens when a closed system collapses on itself. But Thompson went further in his notes. What we are seeing is not simply biology. It is the weaponization of isolation. It is proof that when a group cuts itself off, the hidden weaknesses of the blood are forced to the surface. Think about that. Weakness does not stay hidden forever. Pressure forces it out. It was true in their bodies. It is true in societies. The Blackwoods became living proof of what happens when corruption is hidden long enough. It mutates, it festers, and it consumes everything in its path. The doctors catalogued horrors that even textbooks refused to print. Apert syndrome, skulls fusing too soon, heads warped, dwarfism, hemophilia, degenerating eyesight that left children stumbling through the dirt blind before puberty, infant mortality rates over 60%. For every 10 babies born, 6 were dead before their first birthday. The survivors carried deformities as visible as scars from a battlefield. And yet in the middle of this nightmare, glimmers of humanity still flickered. Harrington wrote of a boy named Samuel, 19 years old, barely 4 feet tall, nearly blind, jaw malformed so severely he could not chew. Yet Samuel could pick up a banjo, and after hearing a melody once, replicate it flawlessly. His fingers, crooked and multiplied, plucked strings with a precision no one could explain. Even in decay, nature creates anomalies of brilliance, Thompson observed. A cruel reminder that even in cages of blood, sparks of the divine try to break through. But Elijah would not allow those sparks to leave the cage. When Abigail, his sister, whispered to Harrington that the family was withering, Elijah silenced her. When younger members expressed curiosity about the outside world, he threatened them with the same shotgun he pointed at trespassers. He told them outsiders mocked them, feared them, wanted to destroy them. He made the world into a monster so that they would never leave the valley. And here's where the truth cuts deeper than medicine. Because this wasn't just a family tragedy, this was a case study in control. Elijah proved what every ruler, priest, and tyrant has known. If you convince people the outside is worse than the cage, they will cling to the bars and call it freedom. The deformities in their bodies were visible. The deformities in their minds were invisible, but far more dangerous. When Harrington and Thompson presented their findings in secret, colleagues were horrified, not just by the medical abnormalities, but by the ethical question: should they intervene? Should they rip apart Elijah's control? Or should they let the family continue in its self-imposed prison? Some argued it was cultural autonomy. Others said it was cruelty to let children be born into such suffering. But what no one admitted out loud was this: the Blackwoods were not unique. There are Blackwoods everywhere. Isolated systems, closed communities, power held by one figure or one ideology, demanding loyalty at the expense of freedom. You don't need to be in Winston County to live in a cage like that. Look at nations, look at religions, look at corporations, look at families that worship tradition over truth. The deformities might not always be physical. Sometimes they are mental, emotional, spiritual, but they are deformities all the same. The Blackwoods forced medicine to look in the mirror, but if you're listening closely, they should force you to do the same. Because here's the secret Elijah knew but never admitted. Once one man escapes the cage, the whole system begins to collapse. That is why he clung so desperately to control. That is why he made deformity sacred. That is why he told his family the outside world was poison. Because he knew the moment someone walked away, the illusion of safety would shatter. And this is where the story shifts. Because not everyone stayed. And when the first cracks formed in Elijah's empire of blood, the descent grew even darker. Elijah Blackwood was a man who believed he had defeated time. For nearly 4 decades, he kept his family locked inside a valley of his own making. No schools, no doctors, no books. Just his word, his rules, his kingdom. But time has a way of catching even the strongest tyrants, and Elijah's grip, though iron, was beginning to rust. It started with hunger. The rocky soil of Winston County had never been kind, but by the late 1950s the crops were failing. Pigs died of disease, corn rotted in the ground. For the first time in years, the Blackwoods' survival depended on the outside world. Elijah hated it, hated being forced into town with his eldest son Robert to barter for flour and canned goods. Every trip was humiliation, whispers, stares, laughter from townsfolk who treated them as circus exhibits. Robert would lower his head silent while Elijah's rage boiled beneath his skin. But here's the truth about tyrants. They can survive humiliation, but they cannot survive doubt. And doubt was growing quietly inside the Blackwood home. Younger members of the family, teenagers mostly, had begun to question why they were forbidden from leaving, why the world outside was painted as hell, when every glimpse of it showed cars, electricity, and freedom. One of them was Abigail, Elijah's niece. At 21, she was already considered a spinster by family standards, unmarried only because Elijah decreed that her womb was too weak to bear strong blood. But Abigail's weakness was not physical, it was her mind. She was curious. She listened when Dr. Harrington spoke during his visits. She whispered to others when Elijah wasn't near. What if the world isn't against us? What if he's lying? And lies, once spoken aloud, spread like fire. In 1958, a state welfare officer named Margaret Keene received word of the Blackwoods after Harrington quietly submitted his notes. At first, the county sheriff resisted. He said interfering would be trouble, that the Blackwoods were God's business. But Keene insisted. She drove into those hills with 2 deputies, arriving at the Blackwood homestead in late spring. What she saw was worse than Harrington's reports. Children half-naked, barefoot, bellies swollen from malnutrition, shacks barely standing, women with hollow eyes, their teeth rotted away, skin pale from lack of sunlight. Keene wrote in her report, "The Blackwood property is less a home and more a graveyard for the living. They are not surviving, they are enduring." But Elijah was ready. When Keene questioned him, he stood tall, shotgun in hand, declaring that the government had no place on his land. The deputies, uneasy, sided with him. They told Keene to leave it alone. And just like that, the state turned its back. Elijah had won, at least on the surface, but the visit planted seeds. Some of the younger Blackwoods saw Keene's car, saw the way she dressed, the way her hair was done, the confidence in her voice. To them, she wasn't a threat. She was proof that life beyond the hills was real, that freedom wasn't just a story. This terrified Elijah. He tightened his rules, curfews, punishments, food rationed for those he deemed loyal. Anyone who spoke of leaving was beaten, sometimes starved. Elijah reminded them of Isaiah's law, "The world is poison. Stay with blood or die with strangers." But no matter how loud he shouted, the silence of the valley grew heavier. Doubt was no longer hidden. It was alive, breathing in the hearts of his children and grandchildren. And then came the storm. In March of 1961, a violent thunderstorm tore through Winston County. Lightning split trees, floodwaters ripped through the valley, and one of the Blackwood cabins collapsed completely. Inside was Mary, Elijah's youngest daughter. She was crushed beneath the beams, her body mangled beyond recognition. Harrington was summoned again, but he could do nothing. Mary's death was a turning point. To the family, it was proof that Elijah's promises of divine protection were lies. To Elijah, it was proof that the outside world had cursed them. He raged, calling the storm God's test, insisting that Mary had died because others had doubted him. In his madness, he blamed Abigail, calling her a traitor. That night, with the storm still raging, Elijah dragged her into the yard, shotgun in hand, and declared that anyone who listened to her would meet the same fate. But he did not pull the trigger. Why? Because even tyrants know the danger of martyrs. Killing Abigail would have made her story stronger. Instead, he exiled her, banished her from the family's land, forcing her into the woods with nothing but the clothes on her back. And here is where the first true crack split the Blackwood Empire. Abigail did not die. She walked. She stumbled, starved, clawed her way through the forest until she reached a neighboring farm. The family there, horrified by her condition, gave her food and shelter. Within weeks, she told her story to officials in town, and this time, they listened. The state returned with force. This time, not welfare officers, but armed men and county health inspectors. They demanded entry. Elijah met them at the gate with his shotgun, screaming that the bloodline would never be broken. For hours, the standoff lasted, but eventually, even Elijah knew he was outnumbered. He lowered his weapon, but his eyes burned with hatred. The inspectors found exactly what Harrington and Keene had described, only worse. Starvation, disease, children too weak to stand. They recommended immediate intervention, removal of the youngest children, medical treatment, possible institutionalization. But politics, as always, complicated everything. Local officials feared the backlash of meddling in family matters. Elijah, furious, threatened violence if anyone tried to take his kin. In the end, the state retreated again, leaving behind only warnings and paperwork. For the Blackwoods, the message was clear. No one was coming to save them. For Elijah, the message was different. The outside world was closing in, and when tyrants feel cornered, they do not surrender. They double down. Elijah began to speak of prophecy, visions of fire, warnings of betrayal. He told his family that Abigail had sold them out, that outsiders would soon come to destroy them all. He gathered the men, armed them, and spoke of war. To the women and children, he promised salvation if they remained loyal. But deep down, even Elijah must have known the truth. The Blackwood dynasty was collapsing. His grip was slipping. The family no longer believed as they once did. Some still obeyed out of fear. Others plotted escape. The cage was cracking, and once cracks form, collapse is inevitable. This is the moment every system of control dreads. The moment obedience no longer feels like safety but suffocation. The moment the people inside the cage realize that the bars were never protection. They were prison walls. The storm had broken the illusion. Abigail had carried the truth beyond the hills, and Elijah's empire of blood was now living on borrowed time. By 1962, Elijah Blackwood was a king with no kingdom. The man who once ruled his family with fire and scripture now lived in constant paranoia. He paced the property at night, shotgun in hand, muttering to himself about betrayal. He had beaten back the doctors, the sheriff, even the state, but he knew the walls were closing in. His bloodline was breaking, his power was slipping. The first to act was Robert, Elijah's eldest son, his right hand, the heir to his twisted throne. Robert had been loyal all his life, but loyalty bends under the weight of hunger and humiliation. His wife had given birth to 3 children, 2 dead within weeks, the third born so deformed he could not even swallow milk. Robert buried them in shallow graves on the hill, listening as Elijah preached that it was God's will. But Robert knew better. He had seen the doctors' faces, seen the pity in their eyes. He understood what Elijah refused to admit. The family was collapsing, and no amount of prayer or blood loyalty could stop it. So Robert made a plan, quietly, carefully. He whispered to his younger brother Daniel and to a cousin named Ruth. At night, when Elijah's voice was quiet and the valley drowned in crickets, they plotted. They would take the younger children, sneak down the mountain, and vanish into the world beyond. But secrets never lasted long in the Blackwood home. One evening, Elijah overheard whispers. He followed them into the barn, where he caught Robert sketching a crude map in the dirt. Elijah erupted. He struck Robert with the butt of his shotgun, knocking teeth from his mouth. He dragged him into the yard, demanded that the others watch, and declared, "This is what happens to traitors." Then he locked Robert in the cellar. For 3 weeks, he was fed nothing but water and scraps. His children cried for him, but Elijah silenced them with threats. The message was clear: escape. He was death. But fear, once broken, cannot be fully restored. Robert's punishment did not erase doubt. It deepened it. Now the family whispered not only of freedom, but of Elijah's madness. His reign was no longer divine. It was desperation, and desperation leads to blood. In the winter of 1963, another storm battered Winston County. Roofs collapsed, food ran out, and sickness spread through the children. Harrington tried to return with supplies, but Elijah barred him from the property, shouting that outsiders brought the plague. By spring, 3 more children were dead, buried beside the others in unmarked graves. That was the breaking point. Ruth, the cousin who had plotted with Robert, decided she would no longer wait. One night, she took her youngest brother by the hand and crept through the woods. They made it 10 miles before Elijah's men, armed with shotguns and dogs, caught them. Ruth was dragged back, beaten so badly she could not stand. Her brother vanished. Some say he was buried in the woods. Others believe he escaped and changed his name forever. No record was ever found. After that, the family lived under a shadow of terror. Elijah no longer trusted anyone. He rationed food only to those who praised him. He forced nightly gatherings where he preached about fire and judgment, insisting that God had chosen the Blackwoods to endure. His voice cracked with rage, his eyes hollow from sleeplessness. He was not a king anymore. He was a dying tyrant, clinging to the only thing he had left, obedience. But obedience was running out. In the summer of 1964, Robert escaped the cellar. He emerged gaunt, scarred, but alive. And this time, he did not run. He confronted his father. Witnesses, what few remain, say Robert stood in the yard, shotgun in hand, and shouted, "You are not God. You are not king. You are the reason we are cursed." Elijah laughed, a dry, bitter laugh that cut through the night. He raised his own shotgun, pointing it at his son. The 2 men, father and son, tyrant and heir, stood face to face, both shaking, both ready to end it. No one knows who fired first. Some say Robert pulled the trigger. Others claim Elijah's gun misfired in the rain. What is certain is this: when the smoke cleared, Elijah Blackwood was lying in the mud, chest torn open, eyes wide in shock. The king of the Blackwoods was dead. For a moment there was silence. Then, chaos. Some wailed, some fled. Some dropped to their knees, convinced judgment had come. Robert stood frozen, blood on his hands, the shotgun clutched to his chest. In that instant, the dynasty ended. The spell was broken. But here's the tragedy. Freedom did not come with Elijah's death. It never does. His shadow lingered. Without his iron rule, the family splintered. Some tried to leave, only to be consumed by poverty and ridicule in the outside world. Others stayed, clinging to the only life they had ever known. The government intervened again, removing children, scattering them into foster care. Records vanish here, birth certificates missing, names changed, trails lost. The Blackwood bloodline dissolved not with a bang, but with a slow fade into obscurity. By the early 1970s, the Blackwood property was abandoned. The cabins rotted. The graves were swallowed by weeds. All that remained were whispers, stories passed in town, rumors of inbred cannibals, ghost tales told to scare children at night. The truth, the human tragedy, was buried under folklore, and maybe that was the final cruelty. Because the Blackwoods weren't monsters, they weren't demons. They were victims of one man's obsession with purity, one family's prison of obedience. They became symbols of decay, not because they were evil, but because they were trapped. Think about it. Elijah didn't need chains to hold them. He didn't need fences or guards. His weapon was belief. His cage was obedience, and it worked. Generation after generation obeyed, until their bodies broke under the weight of it. This is the truth no one wants to hear. Obedience kills. Not quickly, not loudly, but slowly, silently, across decades. It kills not just the body, but the will. It strangles potential, blinds curiosity, and hands power to those least worthy of it. The Blackwoods are a grotesque mirror of what happens when obedience is absolute. Elijah's empire ended in blood, but how many empires today still thrive because obedience keeps them alive? How many leaders, families, corporations, even nations survive not through justice or truth, but through fear, tradition, and the silence of those trapped inside? The Blackwoods died in the hills of Alabama, but their story is still alive, in every system that tells you to obey without question, to trust without proof, to sacrifice freedom for the illusion of safety. And the question remains, are you living free, or are you living in Elijah's shadow? The story of the Blackwoods doesn't end in the mud of Winston County. Elijah's body rotted, his house collapsed, his family scattered, but his shadow remains. It lingers not just in the Appalachian woods, but in the way power operates across the world today. Because here's the secret, the Blackwoods weren't just an accident of isolation. They were a case study in how control is maintained. You think it was about incest, genetics, disease? That was the surface. The real story was obedience. The real story was how one man convinced an entire bloodline to worship their own decay. Do you think you are immune to that? Look around. Modern systems don't need shotguns or locked cellars to keep you in line. They don't need to shout. They whisper. They soothe. They reward compliance with comfort and punish rebellion with exile. Elijah used fear and scripture. Today, systems use entertainment, convenience, and distraction. But the result is the same: obedience. Ask yourself, how many men live lives they did not choose? How many men bury their dreams so their bosses, their governments, their institutions can remain strong? How many families chain themselves to traditions that no longer serve them, yet pass them down as holy law? The Blackwoods were a grotesque extreme. But don't you see? Every society breeds its own Elijahs. Some wear robes, some wear suits, some wear smiles on glowing screens. But their demand is the same: obey. The collapse of the Blackwoods shows us something horrifying. When obedience becomes sacred, suffering becomes invisible. Think of it. Children born twisted, blind, broken, and the family called it normal. They didn't even question it. Their cage was so complete they thought it was home. Now turn the mirror on yourself. What suffering have you normalized? What chains have you accepted as natural? You might not be burying deformed infants in the dirt, but maybe you're burying your potential. Maybe you're strangling your strength, your curiosity, your power because someone told you that was just the way things are. That is how control works. It doesn't need to hold you down if it can convince you to hold yourself down. Elijah understood that. So do the ones who run this world. But here's the dangerous part. The part no one dares to say. When obedience collapses, power collapses with it. Elijah's death proved it. For generations, his word was law. Then one night, one act of defiance, and the dynasty shattered. Centuries of fear ended in a single gunshot. And that is what the world fears most. Not disease, not poverty, not collapse. What it fears is the day men stop obeying. The Blackwoods are gone, but their lesson is carved into stone. Control always rots from within. It does not fail because the tyrant is strong, but because the people finally see him for what he is: weak, a parasite feeding on obedience. Once that spell breaks, the empire falls. But here is where I must challenge you, because this video isn't just a story, it's a mirror. And if you've followed me this far, it means the spell is cracking in you too. You've seen enough to know there's more beneath the surface. You've felt the unease, that voice inside, the one that whispers that you are meant for more. That's not weakness. That is the first spark of freedom. But sparks die if they are not fed. That's why I want you to take this moment and anchor it, right now. In the comments, I want you to write these words: obedience is death, awareness is rebirth. Write it twice, not once, twice. Not for me, but for you. Because repetition locks it in. It etches it into your mind. You are not a spectator here. You are crossing a threshold, and once you step through, there is no going back. Elijah believed his family would remain pure forever. He was wrong. His bloodline rotted, his empire collapsed, his power turned to dust. And yet, the pattern he lived by still thrives today. Institutions that demand your blind obedience are still standing, but only because men like you haven't yet decided to walk away. So ask yourself, how much of your life has been shaped by unseen Elijahs? How much of your energy has been drained by leaders who are nothing more than aging patriarchs hiding behind tradition, law, or ideology? How many times have you silenced your own questions because obedience felt safer than truth? The Blackwoods suffered because they obeyed. The world suffers for the same reason. When Robert finally pulled the trigger, it wasn't just the death of his father, it was the death of a spell, and that moment is the lesson every man must learn. Obedience only has power if you give it. Once you break the spell, the tyrant falls. Do not mistake me, breaking obedience comes at a cost. Robert killed his father and carried that stain until his own death. The family fractured. The survivors carried scars into the outside world. But what is worse, to carry the scars of rebellion or to die obedient in a cage? That is the question the Blackwoods leave us with. And if you're honest with yourself, it is the same question echoing in your own life. Think again about Elijah. He didn't need chains. He didn't need guards. His rule was an illusion, propped up by belief. The family obeyed because they thought they had no choice. They obeyed because they were told outsiders were evil, that blood must remain pure, that safety lived in silence, and they obeyed until their very bodies rotted from the inside out. But look closely. Isn't that the same blueprint used everywhere power thrives? The details change, but the structure is identical. Every empire, every corporation, every institution survives not because its leaders are strong, but because its people are obedient. History is clear. Rome didn't collapse because its enemies stormed the gates. It collapsed because belief in Rome rotted from within. The Soviet Union didn't crumble because of weapons, but because obedience cracked in the minds of its citizens. And even now you can feel it in the world around you. Cracks forming, confidence bleeding out, obedience breaking. The truth is dangerous because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And here it is. Obedience is not loyalty. It is slavery in disguise. Think about the men you know. How many live lives that aren't theirs? How many wake every morning to build another man's empire, obey another man's rules, defend another man's beliefs? They wear suits instead of overalls, stare at screens instead of fields, but their obedience is the same as the Blackwoods. It is inherited, invisible, unchallenged. The Blackwoods became grotesque because their bloodline folded in on itself generation after generation. But what about the bloodlines of nations, institutions, corporations? They too fold in on themselves. The same names, the same dynasties, the same families gripping power century after century. Do you really think the world belongs to the strong? No, it belongs to the obedient. The strong only rise because the obedient hold them up. Elijah was not strong, he was terrified. He knew if even one generation turned away, his rule would collapse. And that is the fear shared by every system of power you see today. Governments don't fear enemies abroad, they fear awareness at home. Corporations don't fear competitors, they fear the day men stop consuming. Religions don't fear heretics, they fear the day believers stop obeying, so they work tirelessly to keep you asleep. They bury you in distraction, drown you in comfort, feed you half-truths and endless noise. Not because they love you, but because they fear what happens if you wake up. Elijah told his family outsiders would corrupt them. Modern systems tell you the same in softer words. Stay here, stay safe, stay small. They don't need to beat you into silence if you silence yourself. But here is the lesson buried in the bones of the Blackwoods. All cages rot from the inside. Elijah's power didn't last. It never does. Tyranny is never permanent. The only question is, how long will men wait before they break the spell? This is where the Blackwoods become more than a story. They become a prophecy. Their downfall is the same downfall every empire faces. First comes isolation, cutting the people off from the outside world. Then comes corruption, decay hidden beneath obedience. Then comes fracture, one act of defiance, shattering centuries of fear. And finally, collapse, an empire falling not from outside attack, but from within. The cycle repeats endlessly. And yet, men still cling to their cages, still obey, still feed the very systems that consume them. Why? Because obedience is easier than freedom. Freedom is blood. Freedom is loss. Freedom means stepping into the unknown, just as Robert did when he turned the gun on his father. But what about you? You who sit here listening, drawn to forbidden history, hungry for secrets. What cage are you in? Who is your Elijah? A father, a boss, a preacher, a politician, a faceless system whispering that you are small, powerless, replaceable. Whoever it is, know this. Their power lives only in your obedience. And if you are still obeying, still kneeling, then you are no different than the Blackwoods burying their children under the hill, calling it normal. That is the truth few can bear to face. The Blackwoods are not just history. They are the mirror of obedience itself, and that mirror reflects you. You might tell yourself, I'm nothing like them. I'm free. I make my own choices. But do you, or have your choices already been written for you by the systems you never questioned, the beliefs you never challenged, the paths you never dared to abandon? Freedom is not claiming independence. Freedom is breaking the spell, and most men never do. That is why I told you to write those words, because repetition is how you rewire your mind. Obedience is death, awareness is rebirth. It is not just a phrase, it is a key, and if you hold it you can walk out of the cage. But if you ignore it, if you bury it, then the cage holds you forever. The Blackwoods died in isolation. Their empire ended with a gunshot. But their lesson survives, and the question it leaves burning in the ashes is this: will you carry the blood of obedience into your children, your work, your legacy, or will you be the one who ends it? Because someone always ends it. History belongs not to the obedient but to the one who breaks the chain. One act of defiance, one refusal to kneel, shatters centuries of fear. That is the truth Elijah tried to bury. That is the truth every system of power prays you never learn. So now you know. The question is, what will you do with it? Why do men obey? Why did the Blackwoods generation after generation follow Elijah even as their children withered, even as their bodies decayed? Why didn't they rise earlier? Why didn't they walk away? That is the part that disturbs me most, because the answer is not madness, not stupidity, not ignorance. The answer is this: obedience feels safe. Think about it. To obey is to give up responsibility. To obey is to silence the voice of doubt. To obey is to hand your fear to someone else and let them carry it. That is what Elijah offered. He said, don't think, don't question, don't choose. Just obey me and God will bless you. And they did. Because deep down, every human being fears freedom more than chains. Freedom is terror. Freedom means if you fail, you have no one to blame. Obedience gives you an excuse. If life collapses, you can say, I was just following orders. The Blackwoods were not monsters. They were human, just like you. And that's the part that should make your stomach turn, because their obedience was not unique. It was ordinary. They obeyed for the same reason you obey, because disobedience is dangerous. Look at your own life. How many times have you kept quiet when you wanted to speak? How many times have you followed the rule you didn't believe in because it was easier? How many times have you surrendered your will, not to Elijah Blackwood, but to the Elijahs of this world? To a boss, a parent, a pastor, a system, a tradition? You tell yourself it's harmless, but every act of obedience carves a scar, no matter how small. Over time, those scars become your identity, until one day you look in the mirror and realize you don't know who you are anymore. You only know who you were told to be. That is the horror of obedience. It doesn't just control your actions. It rewires your very sense of self. The Blackwoods obeyed until they could no longer imagine anything else. Their bloodline collapsed, and still they stayed. Not because Elijah was strong, but because their obedience had become their identity. And I wonder, has the same thing happened to you? Think of all the cages men live in today. Cages built from screens, wages, and promises of safety. Men obey algorithms, obey bosses, obey political slogans, obey social norms. They obey so deeply they don't even see it as obedience anymore. They call it normal life. But isn't that exactly what the Blackwoods said as they buried their children in the dirt? Here's the truth no one dares whisper. Obedience is seductive. It feels holy. It feels righteous. It feels comfortable. That's why men cling to it even as it destroys them. Because the alternative, freedom, is unbearable. Freedom is chaos. Freedom is risk. Freedom is the weight of responsibility crushing your shoulders. But here's the paradox. Freedom is also the only path to life. Obedience looks safe, but it is death. Freedom looks deadly, but it is life. That's why the Blackwoods died where they stood, while Robert, the one who broke obedience, at least tasted truth, even if it came soaked in blood. So ask yourself, what part of you is still a Blackwood? What beliefs do you obey that you never chose? What fears keep you kneeling? What habits, traditions, and rules rot your strength while you smile and call it normal? You may think this is distant, just a story, but look deeper. Obedience is in your daily routine. It is in the way you work jobs that drain your soul. It is in the way you consume what they feed you. It is in the way you silence your questions, bury your desires, and accept the script written for you. You don't live in a cabin in Winston County, but maybe you live in a cage just as invisible, just as deadly. That's why I told you before to write the words. Obedience is death. Awareness is rebirth. Because awareness is the weapon Elijah could not fight. Awareness is the moment you see the cage for what it is. Awareness is the crack in the spell, but awareness alone is not enough. Many of the Blackwoods knew something was wrong. Robert knew, Ruth knew, Daniel knew, but most of them stayed. They obeyed because disobedience felt too heavy. Awareness without action is just torment. It is knowing you are in a cage, but lacking the will to walk out. So the question becomes, when will you act? Not tomorrow, not someday. When? Because cages don't open themselves. Empires don't collapse on their own. Elijah didn't just vanish. Someone had to raise the gun. Someone had to bleed. Someone had to break the chain. That is the cost of freedom. Blood, sacrifice, exile. That's why so few choose it. And yet, every great transformation in history began with one man who refused to obey. One man who decided the cage was worse than the risk. One man who saw the Elijah in his life and said, no more. So I ask you now, not as a storyteller, not as a voice in your headphones, but as a man to another man. What is your Elijah? What cage holds you? And will you be the one to end it? Or will you pass it down to your children as the Blackwoods did? Because someone always pays the price. Either you, in the fire of rebellion, or your children, in the slow decay of obedience. That is the truth, and you cannot unhear it. Listen closely, because what I'm about to say is not a story. It's not history. It's not even opinion. It's a test. If you've stayed this long, through the mud, the graves, the rotting bloodline of the Blackwoods, then part of you is already awake. You felt the shiver in your chest, the unease in your gut. You know I'm not just talking about them, I'm talking about you. So let me say it clearly, you are inside your own Blackwood Valley right now. Your Elijah is not a bearded patriarch in a shotgun shack. Your Elijah wears the face of the world around you. Bosses, governments, traditions, algorithms, illusions of safety. Your cage is not made of wood and rust. It is built from routine, distraction, and fear. And just like the Blackwoods, you've called it normal. But cages do not care what you call them. They only care that you stay inside. So here is the initiation. Ask yourself, what price am I willing to pay to be free? Because freedom will not come cheap. It never has. Robert learned that the night he raised the gun against his father. The Blackwoods who whispered of escape learned it when their throats filled with dirt. Freedom demands blood, metaphorical or literal. It demands exile from the comfortable silence of the obedient. It demands that you stand alone, hated, mocked, misunderstood. Most men will not pay that price. Most men will stay obedient, kneel quietly, and call it life. That is why the world belongs to tyrants. Because tyrants know obedience is easier than courage. But you are here. You have heard this story. And hearing it means you no longer have an excuse. You cannot pretend you don't see the cage. You cannot pretend you don't hear the whisper in your own chest. That whisper is not weakness. It is the beginning of rebellion. Say the words again, out loud if you dare. Obedience is death. Awareness is rebirth. Say it again. Let it cut into you. Let it burn the silence out of your throat. Write it, repeat it, seal it into your mind, because this is not entertainment, this is ritual, this is the tearing down of Elijah's ghost inside you. Do you feel the weight of it? Good. That weight is the cost of responsibility. Freedom is not the absence of chains, it is the acceptance of burden. The burden of thinking for yourself, the burden of risking everything, the burden of walking into the dark without a map, because obedience will not guide you anymore. That is the path the Blackwoods could not take. That is why they rotted where they stood. They waited for freedom to come without cost, and so it never came. But Robert, flawed, broken, haunted Robert, he proved the truth. One act of defiance shatters centuries of obedience. One man with the will to say no more can end a dynasty. Now it is your turn. Do you think Elijah is gone? He isn't. He's in every system that tells you to obey without question. He's in every tradition that punishes curiosity. He's in every smiling leader who thrives on your silence. Elijah never died. He just changed his face, and he is feeding on you right now. Every second you obey blindly, every dream you bury, every risk you refuse to take, that is Elijah's ghost eating your life from the inside. So what will you do? Stay silent? Obey? Pretend you didn't hear this? That's the easy path. That's the Blackwood path, the path of graves and forgotten names. Or will you choose the harder road? The road of rebellion, of risk, of standing alone and tearing your own cage apart piece by piece? You already know the answer. You feel it burning. You wouldn't still be here if you didn't. The question is whether you'll act on it. Because this is not just a video. This is not just a story. This is a mirror. And mirrors demand a choice. Look into it and decide. Are you the obedient child burying another generation in silence? Or are you the rebel with the gun in his hands ending the dynasty once and for all? The Blackwoods are gone. Their cabins are dust. Their graves swallowed by weeds. But the lesson they left is eternal. Obedience kills. Awareness saves. Action transforms. So make the choice. Right now. Out loud. Write it. Claim it. Burn it into your chest. Say, I end the cage. I end the Elijah in me. If you can say that and mean it, then you have already crossed the threshold. If you can't, then you will carry Elijah's ghost into your children and will pay the price you were too weak to bear. This is not about the Blackwoods anymore. This is about you. And now you know the truth. Every cage is waiting for a rebel. Every tyrant is waiting for the one man who says no. Every system of obedience is one heartbeat away from collapse. The only question is, will that heartbeat be yours? And so here we are, at the end of the valley, at the edge of the graves, at the silence where the Blackwood dynasty finally collapsed. The cabins are gone. The wood has rotted, the paths are overgrown. But if you stand there today in the thick of the Alabama woods, you can still feel it. The stillness, the weight, the echo of lives lived in chains. You can feel Elijah's voice, not in the air, but in your chest. Because Elijah never truly died. He survives as long as obedience survives. And here's the truth that chills me most. There will always be another Elijah. Always. Another man, another system, another voice demanding silence and loyalty. The names change, the faces change, the costumes change. But the game remains the same. Control, obedience, collapse. That cycle will outlive you and me, but it doesn't have to own you. The Blackwoods could not escape it. They chose silence until their bloodline turned to dust. But you are standing at a crossroad they never saw. You can see the pattern, you can see the cage, you can see the way out. But seeing is not enough. The earth is full of men who saw and still obeyed. Men who felt the spark of rebellion, then smothered it out of fear. Men who heard the whisper of truth, then drowned it in noise and comfort. Their lives are graves with no markers. Forgotten, buried by their own obedience. The question is, will you join them? Because here is the final lesson of the Blackwoods. Obedience is hereditary. It is passed like a disease from father to son, mother to child. If you do not break it, you will hand it down, and your children will live in a cage you built, believing it is home. That is the curse Elijah left behind, not inbreeding, not decay, not violence, but obedience. And curses do not break themselves. So the burden falls to you. Right now, in this moment, you are not watching history, you are repeating it. The essay, me silence, the same excuses, the same fear of breaking free, unless you decide otherwise. And if you don't, then Elijah wins again. Think about that. A man dead for half a century still ruling you from the grave, not because he is alive, but because obedience is. So I'll ask you one last time, who is your Elijah? What cage are you still kneeling in? And will you let your bloodline, your life, your legacy, rot in silence the way his did? Or will you be the one who ends it? If you end it, your name will never be famous. The world will not applaud you, but you will know. And those who come after you will breathe freer air because you chose to pay the price. That is the true inheritance of rebellion. Not glory, not comfort, but freedom. And if you do not end it, then your children will whisper the same excuses. They will feel the same weight. They will live in the same cage. And one day, they too will rot in silence, wondering why no one had the courage to break it. That is the final mirror of the Blackwoods. Their tragedy was not that they lived in a cage. Their tragedy was that no one dared to break it until it was too late. Do not wait. Do not tell yourself there will be another chance. There won't. The cage does not open itself. Freedom is not handed down. It is taken with blood, with sacrifice, with risk, always. So here is my final gift to you. A sentence, a curse, a key. Repeat it now. Burn it into yourself. Obedience is death. Awareness is rebirth. I end the Elijah in me. Say it again, out loud. Let it echo in your room. Let it stain the silence. Let it follow you into your dreams. Because that sentence is not just words. It is the doorway. The line between life and death. Between cage and freedom. Between silence and rebellion. The Blackwoods could not cross it, but you can. And maybe, if enough men do, Elijah will finally die. But until then, his ghost waits, watching, feeding, smiling every time you kneel. So I leave you with this question, the only question that matters, the question that will echo in you long after this ends. Will you obey, or will you end the cage?